They talking here about the Youngs how to change the tape. The Youngs left and went to Pontiac, and he taught in the Pontiac system for many, many years. Now, then we had a teacher by the name of Bertha Klein. She taught the Latin. Now, occasionally we had other people who taught Latin that you probably remember too, like Genevieve Raines. But at that time, Latin was a very sacred cow as far as high school was concerned, and they actually taught 4 years of it. The first year was just general Latin, the second year was called Caesar, the third year was called Cicero, and I believe, I'm not sure about this, but I think that the fourth year was called Virgil. And there were a certain number of kids that took all 4 years, and was supposed to have been very, very good for anybody going into an academic program. I never found any substantiation of that fact after I got into colleges. I did take 2 years in Latin. I did take 2 years of German after I got to Michigan State, but I found no substantiation that that was a great, but it was nevertheless, 2 years of Latin was considered a normal amount for anybody going into any college or university beyond high school. Then we also had Josie Schutz. Josie Schutz later became Josie Valentine, and she taught grade school music, and she also had a class that met after school called high school choir, high school chorus. They met after school. They had no other place to meet. The only place that they could meet was in the assembly hall. That's where the piano was, and of course it was pretty hard to hold a class in high school chorus while the assembly hall was going. And so I might say about that old assembly hall, there was a raised platform in the middle. I mean, as you entered, there were two big rooms, two big doors, double doors, and went into that assembly hall. And between the two doors was the principal's office. That was nothing more than a raised platform, about 18 inches above the normal height, probably about 8 by 10 area. He had his desk up there, and he could reach back and ring the bell, which meant the classes would separate. Now, also out of that room, there was a fire escape that went from the second floor right down outside. It was covered, and when we had fire drills, that door was open, and people in that half the building, or part of them, went down the fire escape. So that, but it was it was a big room, and it was also used for General Assembly purposes. If a lecturer came to town, if they frequently held the lecture at the assembly room. Now, there was one general area, there was another big assembly area for Roger City at that time called the rink. The Roger City Athletic Club, they called it the RAC Hall, and it was located right where the bowling alley is. And that's where they played basketball. And that's where it was originally built for a roller rink. But it had a basketball floor in it, and that's where the Roger City High School basketball teams played in their early days before there was a high school gym. And that building burned just before the new high school was completed. And for a year, all of the games that the high school played had to be played away from home because we had no place here to play them. That happened probably about the winter of 1926, 27, 27, and 28, because the new building was just completed in the spring of 1928. But that's the old RAC Hall or old rink, as that you'll hear about if you read the early history of Roger City. But many of the smaller functions that came to town, lecturers, things of that type, or lyceums, they did hold in the auditorium or the large assembly hall at the high school. Now, who else was on that faculty? Well, Howard Gilpin, of course, the superintendent. He was a teacher, a regular teacher in the faculty. He taught U.S. government, and in the 8th grade, and he also taught U.S. government and economics in the 12th grade. And I know that after I became superintendent, I was still teaching economics and civics. And for a while, then when that became a little bit hard to follow because I got into building programs, I usually ended up teaching a class in speech. But it was very common. During the time that I was principal, from 1944 to 1950, I taught regular classes, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. Now, as you remember, John Sibley used to do the same thing. He often did the same thing. Being part of the faculty. I deliberately, even up to the last year that I taught, I kept my finger in. I took a couple of assemblies in the building just so that I could stay up with the kids, because I learned a lot from the kids as to what was happening in the school. And nowadays, of course, I suppose that's frowned on, but nevertheless, I always thought it was very proper. Now, and then we had another person on the faculty at that time, and that was a commerce teacher named Beatrice Comlecoy. Now, she taught the shorthand. They had 2 years of shorthand at that time. They taught 2 years of bookkeeping at that time. And then they had about 6 typewriters, which made up the typing department. They couldn't handle any more than that. They didn't have any room for any more than that. But nevertheless, the kids that were on a commercial program, because we only had 2 programs, you either had the academic program or you had the commercial program. Most kids in high school, if they were on the general program, you had a limited amount that you could take. There was 4 years of English, there was 4 years of social studies, and then there was science, general science, and chemistry and physics, and most kids, regardless whether they wanted it or not, if they didn't take commerce, if they didn't take shorthand and or bookkeeping, then they probably took chemistry and physics. And but you got to remember that a lot of kids in those days were serious. If they went to high school, they were quite serious. And so most of the kids, and now you also remember this, that not everybody went to high school. A lot of kids at that time dropped out when they got through the 8th grade. Employment was easy. You could get a job at the plant for a boy at 16. The labor laws didn't apply yet at that time. Or you could go downstate in the factories and get jobs. Or you could go sailing on the boats. And then a lot of times the girls left, took jobs out of town, or a lot of them at age 16 got married. It wasn't considered as to get through high school as much as it is now. And so a lot of kids just didn't plan any more than getting through the 8th grade or getting to be 16. A lot of good kids dropped out. I know that I started with, they dropped out, not so much after they got into high school, but before that they didn't get to high school. They just, that was it. It wasn't considered absolutely necessary, and I guess some people don't think it's absolutely necessary even today. But of course it is. Now there are a couple other people that came into the high school at that time after now you got to remember that when we moved in there into that new building in 2728, there was immediately, of course, expansion of the curriculum. We added such things as the shop and drawing department. Milt Hoffer came in there. We added a big commerce department, and a lady by the name of Frida Olson came in there. Instead of having 6 typewriters, they had 20. And then another one of the teachers that came in there that took Field's place was a lady by the name of Isabel Craig. Then take Mrs. Young's place was a girl by the name of Charlotte English. Now, Charlotte English, I remember, was out of Oconto, Wisconsin. She was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. Then there was Ruth Adams Hamilton, and she taught in math and then phys ed, girls phys ed. There was Catherine Davis. She married Gooden, Lloyd Gooden. She used to teach in the history department. And then there was Genevieve Raines, of course, who subbed in Latin and English and was a graduate of the University of Michigan. Her maiden name was Genevieve McLouth. And I kind of think that Genevieve McLouth and Martha Ritchie's mother knew each other when they were going to the University of Michigan. They were both English majors, and of course Mrs. Raines was an English teacher, but she also was a fine pianist and organist, as you recall. And then one of the teachers that I had for chemistry and physics was a man named John Strandberg. And he was followed afterwards, after he left, the next year by Paul Thornley that came in. And he taught here chemistry and physics for years. Then we had the first boys phys ed teacher came in here, a man named Hurdle Feeman. Now Hurdle was out of Adrian, and he came in and he coached the first football team that we had in the fall of 1928. We had the first football team, and he was the coach. He was also the coach of the basketball team. And at that time, we had a school nurse. We had a couple of them, as I recall. One of them was named Edna Shane, and the other one that I recall, his name was Sullivan. I just can't think of her name, or what her first name was. But those are some of the people that that you were in contact with. We are, you got to remember, all of us have been subjected to a lot of teachers during our time, and every one of those left a little bit of them rubbed off. Because after all, all teachers, you might say, are futurists. They're in that game because they're preparing people for the future. If they didn't care to prepare teachers for the future, they should never go into education. Because teachers are futurists. Everything that they do, the kids that they work with, all are representative of things that are going to happen later on. The kids that you have in your class, if you're a teacher, you never know exactly what's going to happen. Sometimes you have to wait for years, and lots of times some wonderful things happen to the people that you had as kids in your class. Now, teachers are catalysts. They're the pushers. They're the shovers. They're the people that kick and moan and groan when you don't produce as kids. But that's what they are. They're pushing you to the future. You got to remember that at all times. It doesn't make any difference whether it's elementary school, high school, or the highest college or academy in the nation. They're all teachers in there. Even the great university of the world, those people that you take classes from are teachers. It can be West Point, it can be Annapolis, it can be Columbia, or it can be the University of Michigan, Michigan State. People that are working there are all working for one thing. They're working for the future, because the future is represented by the kids that they have in class. Because schools, after all, are nothing more buildings themselves. The school buildings themselves are nothing more than the bulwarks of the Republic. They are the fortifications. Wherever you see a school building, that is a symbol of the future. It stands there. That building stands there. It's nothing more probably than mortar and steel and brick. But what happens in that building that's what counts. And so in our great multi-ethnic society that we have here in this country, those schools that's where it happens. That's where it happens. They often say that as far as education is concerned, that in a democracy that is working within the framework of a republic, that it is an inefficient political system to which no one has ever devised a better alternative. And I guess that's true as far as public education is concerned. In a multi-ethnic society that we have in this country today, nobody has ever devised a better system of education to cover that multi-ethnicity than a public school system where we take everybody. We take everybody. Now, it's one thing to go into a country like France or Germany or Belgium or Holland or Japan where they claim that they have such wonderful, efficient systems of education. You go in there and go to Japan, the kids are Japanese. You go to Germany, they're Germans. But you come to the United States and go to a city like Philadelphia or New York or Washington, D.C., and you get the darndest conglomeration of ethnic people of every color under the sun. And so the public school system that was devised in this country is very unique. There's no other country in the history of the world that has so many ethnic qualities as we have in this country, becoming more and more prominent all the time. You hear a lot of kicking and complaints about the failure of the public school system in this country. That's a bunch of hogwash. It's the people that have failed the school system. The school system hasn't failed. The people have failed the system itself. And that's, I sincerely mean that. If the people in this country want better education, if they want better discipline for their kids, they're going to have to demand it. Right now, the public doesn't demand. They don't even demand good discipline. Parents are afraid to let the schools use their discipline. They haul them into court. I know, because the last years that I was superintendent of school, I spent a lot of time in court on discipline cases. Absolutely unnecessary, a bunch of foolishness. But nevertheless, that's the way society is today. But don't let anybody sell you short on the American system of public education, because no nation in the world has ever devised an alternative method that is anywhere near as good. Okay, here we go again. Now, just a few more comments here on things in general about the schools that I thought I might add here at this time. We mentioned the fact that in the old high school, I'm talking about the old red brick, where I spent the first almost 3 years of high school, that they had a large assembly hall, and it was common, or it was a very custom in those days, that on Friday afternoon, about maybe the last 15 or 20 minutes, that we would have a general assembly, and Gilpin used to come in, and he would lead singing to the group. We sang songs. Josie Schutz would play the piano, and we sang songs out of old Pat's pick and also general songbooks. Most of them were familiar at the time. And then also at that time, on certain days, we had a movie. Now, this was silent movies, of course, at that time, or they were the first beginnings of what you call, but most of them were silent. And or they would add other entertainment, maybe sometimes. Sometimes some kid could play the piano. He played the piano recital, or played the piano. And then I know my brother Herman, he would play the violin for a couple tunes. And somebody else would have an accordion, they played a couple tunes. But mostly was given over to singing, and a lot of it were school songs, college songs, songs that came out of World War II, and but a lot of them were patriotic songs, and they always ended by singing the Star Spangled Banner. Now, in those buildings at that time, of course, we had regular wall clocks, the old-fashioned wall clock that the janitor would come in every Friday, and he would wind. They were 8-day clocks, but the janitor would come in as he cleaned up on Friday, and he'd wind every clock that was in the building. Now, also at that time, of course, the elementary school bell had been ringing for years. Now, the elementary school bell was the one that was located in the steeple of the old yellow school. Now, it didn't ring for the high school classes, which started at 8 o'clock, but the first bell ordinarily would ring about 20 minutes to 9 when the elementary school started. And then the bell would ring again at 9 o'clock, and those that weren't there in time, of course, became tardy. And I remember the old janitor that used to ring the bell. He was he would ring the bell with one hand, he'd open the door to see whether anybody was coming down the street, running like lickety-split so they wouldn't be late. And if a kid was running, he'd keep ringing the bell. He'd wait till the kid got into his room, and then he would stop. He didn't want the kid to be late. So that was it. Now, at that time when I was in high school, we still did not have any school buses. And they didn't come in until just a little bit later. I checked this with several of the people who lived out here in the country. Now, in the area up by the state park, and there was a school up there called the Claybank School. And the kids that lived in that area along what called Nagel Highway, they attended that school. The kids that there was another school called the Horn School, which is located on Winslow Road up near what they call the County Poor Farm. And the kids in that part of the township, they attended that school. Now, the kids that lived in near the plant, what they call Little Italy, of course, there was no school down there. The Crawford's Quarry School had closed years ago. And so those kids, ordinarily, until about, maybe about early 30s, had to get to school the best they could. They would walk to school in the morning and walk home at night. That was a long hike, a couple miles, and then some. And later on, after I got back, just about the time I got back here to teach, they started transportation. The first transportation they had was private cars. And there was a lady by the name of Mrs. Giovanoro. She had a car, and she was apparently hired by the Board of Education to transport the 6, 8, or 10 kids. She'd crowd them in a car and bring them to school and then take them home again at night. Now, that wasn't, of course, necessary. Now, after 1935, when I came back here, the board had buses. And one of the buses went down, picked up those kids at the plant, and then would come back, and they would rush up to Nagel Highway, up the Claybanks area, and get those kids. And then a little later on, we rushed up the other way and picked kids up that were from the area around the Poor Farm area there, or Clay Road. So, but nevertheless, kids in town just walked. Everybody walked to school anyway, and of course a large number of kids stayed over lunch hour. Now, the lunch hour in the early days here in the high school, when I was in high school, was an hour and 15 minutes. And that permitted most kids who lived here in town to get home, get a bowl of soup, and come back. And that's exactly what it did. I don't ever recall in all the years that I went to school that I ever took a lunch. And I don't think the rest of the kids ever did either, unless it was just something special. But most kids could get home within probably, 7, 8, 10 minutes, eat a lunch, and then come back and still have time to spare. So that's exactly what happened. And so also another thing I remember is that during the time that I was in grade school and high school, we wrote with pen and ink. If you had to use pen and ink to do penmanship, then you used a straight pen. It was called a straight steel pen, and you had ink wells at your desk. You had regular ink wells that contained ink. And some of the old desks that you see around here from years ago, always a little corner up here where there was a place for an ink well. And regular ink was used when you had to write with ink. Now, of course, kids that were going into business, they had to get quite proficient at writing with a pen and ink. Otherwise, they used the pencil. The fountain pen was just starting to come into prominence, around 26, 27, 28, in that area. Some of the early fountain pens were developed. It's interesting to note that how they made the ink. Ink was made out of a product. You bought almost like a can of frozen fruit juice. You had a small container, and you put this in and added a gallon of water, and that made your ink. It was an ink concentrate, and you just made ink by adding water to it. But that's the way the thing was handled. Now, there were regular commercially afterwards. Then they also bought regular commercial ink. But in the early days, because you have a large quantity of it, it got quite expensive. So they had a regular product on which they could make ink. Now, let's see here. What else do I have here that I can mention? The bell, I might say, that bell that rang in the steeple of the old wooden building was taken down at the time that building was torn down, and is now in a kind of a little roofed area in one of the courtyards of the high school. And that bell was, of course, put up there at the time that building was built in 1902. And but it rang thousands of kids to class over the years in the Rogers City public school system. I want to continue a story here that I kind of got shut off on. I happen to remember I didn't complete it. I told you that when I entered kindergarten that year, there were 106 kids reported. Well, obviously, one teacher couldn't handle 106 kids. So I said that probably about 10 or 12 were sent back home because they were too young. And in certain cases, probably about 8 or 10 were sent on to the first grade, and it proved to be, as he said, it was all right. We probably ended up, he said, he thought with about 84 kids. So so they created a morning session and an afternoon session of the kindergarten with about 42 in each. And that was it. Of course, that was those rooms were big. They were probably, 1,000 square feet. And so they could handle it very well. And but I mean, I just wanted to clear that one point up as to what happened in that particular case. But the plant was going full blast. They were bringing in a lot of people, and as I told you one time before, probably about 12 or 1,300 men were working at the plant. It was very, very labor intensive at that time. And so, of course, these people were coming in and had kids with them, and so they had to be provided for. And so this is another interesting comment I'd like to make here at this time. Carl D. Bradley, of course, was quite an entrepreneur, and he wanted the best for the people who worked at his plant. And when this was before they had the new high school, he, after they built the Westminster Church, the new stone church, he wanted people coming out of the high school to take jobs, of course, at the quarry, if there were jobs available. And but he needed people who had a little bit more background than had just general education, and he wanted people more in the engineering field. And so he told the Board of Education, he was on the board, of course, that if he had made arrangements with the Westminster Church Board of Directors that they gave him a room in the basement of the new church building, the new Westminster Church building that had been built along about 23, 24 in that area. And he bought the necessary desks, he bought the necessary equipment, chairs, tables, and then he told the kids that were juniors and seniors in high school, if they wanted to take a course in mechanical drawing, which he would provide the instructor. And now this wasn't a credit course. And so he took his vice president, the first man under him was a man named Hugh Lewis, who was the vice president. And Hugh Lewis taught a class in mechanical drawing at the Westminster Church. He had about 12, 13 kids, and they went there after school, right after school, every day. And he taught them for an hour or two, whatever it was, on Saturdays also included. And he instructed those kids on how to do mechanical drawing, how to blueprint, and how to read symbols, so that if they got a job at the plant, they'd be of some value to them. And you know, some of those kids completed that course. They were hired after they were graduated, and some of those kids went on to high positions at Michigan Line as a result of that training. Then, of course, after the new high school was built, one of the first things they put in there was a class of mechanical drawing. And those sent over to the new high school and became the starter point for the mechanical drawing department. But Carl D. Bradley furnished all the material, furnished the sets of tools, and after they completed the course, he gave each one of the kids that took the course, he gave them a set of tools. So he was a go-getter. He knew what he was after, but he also understood that there were things that that school did not have, and that was one of the things, of course, that prompted the building of the new high school. He was on the Board of Education at the time, of course, that building was built. But he knew what he wanted for the people of the community, and was a very enterprising entrepreneur who was very much interested in the youth of the community. He also made it possible for many kids to go on to universities, colleges. He provided loan money to those people so they could go on to Michigan and engineering schools, other engineering schools, and become graduate individuals. A lot of kids did that. They borrowed money. Carl D. Bradley through Michigan Lime loaned them money. They came back at summers. Sometimes they took off a term or a semester to work on the boats. We gave them jobs so that they could repay it. And now I didn't happen to have that advantage. I borrowed money, all right, but borrowed it through the bank. But nevertheless, he had arranged, I know that he arranged that the bank would loan money to kids who wanted to go to college, as long as they paid it back, and which I don't know of any time they ever defaulted it. But I know that I borrowed money to complete my master's degree, especially at the University of Michigan, and eventually paid it back. But I mean, the impetus for that came out of Carl D. Bradley urging the bank to loan young kids money if they wanted to go to school. It was a good investment, and he proved to be right. Now, while we still have a little room on this tape, talk about a few other things that I kind of forgot to mention or just talked about briefly in regard to the my educational experiences. In addition to the public school, of course, within the within Rogers City itself, or in the village of Rogers, we did have two church-related schools: St. John's Lutheran School and St. Ignatius Catholic School. Now, St. John's, according to the record, started about 1916, and the first teacher was a Reverend Ross. And that was used primarily for religious instructions as well as general education. And in the early days, that instruction was all given in German. Now, also, in addition to that, there was St. Ignatius School. St. Ignatius congregation, as well as St. John's, started along right after the village was established back in about 1871. They had churches, but they didn't have church buildings and for education. So St. Ignatius School was built on South 3rd Street, and that's where it started in about 1920. Now, also out here in the country in the Belknap area was St. Michael's School. Now, I'm not sure about the date that started, but I assume it was probably around 1920 or maybe just a little bit before that. But it was a well-established school and is still going today. Now, somebody asked me about, before you had transportation, which was probably starting about 1935, I'm just guessing now, how did those kids from out here in the rural areas get to school? Well, I said, first of all, they attended the rural schools. There was the Claybank School in Rogers Township, and earlier than that, of course, there had been a school at Crawford's Quarry. There was the school on Nagle Highway, Claybanks. And then there was the Horn School, which is over here in the Wenzel area, around the Poor Farm. And there were several other schools that were in homes. There was a short time, there was a school in the Hallbauer House out here at the edge of town, and there was a Spence School, which was nothing more than a room that they rented in a home out on Spence Road. Now, these people who wanted to come to high school in those days, in the early days, had to, of course, fend for themselves. They had to get in here because the townships did not provide transportation. And so what happened was that these kids coming in from Mulkey or from Belknap or Bismarck, Hawks area or Metz area, wanted to go to high school. That is after 8th grade, 9th grade or 10th grade or whatever it happened to be. they had to come in and fend for themselves. Now, what they did in those days, they came in and stayed with relatives or friends. Kids would come in on a Monday morning early and bring some groceries with them or eat all their meals with relatives. I know that some kids, for example, some group of kids that came in from the Belknap area, there were 3 or 4 of them, they came in and they brought almost a week's groceries with them. They rented a small apartment which had a stove in it, a couple beds, and they just cooked for themselves all week long. And Friday afternoon after school, they went back to their homes out in Mulkey or Belknap or where it would have to be. But come Monday morning, they would get up early and pack their bag and their groceries, and they'd walk to town. Or if they got a ride, fine. But if not, that's the way they did that. Now, I know that they were coming in from the outlying areas. I know kids that came in from Mulkey, came in from Hawks, and a lot of these people, as I say, stayed with relatives or friends. I know that, for example, in our family, my Uncle Ed came in for a couple of years in the 9th and 10th grade in the old wooden building. He opened, taught the class. And then also Ed Hardy's from Belknap came in and to take a couple of years of high school. Because 4 years of high school in Rogers City did not start until 1917. That was when 1917-18 was the first year that Rogers City went to the 12th grade. Now, the kids that came in at that time, of course, if they wanted to complete their high school or they wanted to go on to college and university, there was a way that they could do that. Now, for example, Uncle Ed, I know, came in, and I think he stayed for a year or two with my dad and mother. And that is from Metz. And then he went on and went to Michigan State. He went to East Lansing. Now, they would accept kids under those conditions at that time. You remember our dad, George. He got through the schools in Metz, then he worked in the woods for a couple of years, finally decided to want to find some way to earn a little more money rather than farming, and so he went to the county normal, that was Rogers City at that time, became a teacher in the rural school for several years, and then decided that he wanted to do something different, get advanced work, and so it was provided at that time that he went to Central Michigan University. They would accept kids in those days. They gave them certain courses similar to our GED test, found out what their proficiency was in English and math and writing, reading, things of that type. And if they figured that they could try it, they let them try the college courses. And that's actually what happened. They gave these kids a chance, and if they could cut the mustard, okay, they stayed. And then they went back for summer schools. In certain cases, they stayed right on. Well, I know that's what Ed Grambua did because he went to Michigan State. Edward Hardy's from Belknap. He did the same thing. He went to Michigan State, stayed on. And those fellows stayed on to get their degrees at those universities. They were both teachers in agriculture. And so that's the way that went. Now, Dad later on, remember, after a few years, he decided that he would like to go into business. And so the proper place to go then for a young kid who didn't have any further education was to go to Ferris, where Ferris had an outstanding school in business administration. And they did the same thing there. He went there and he took courses in banking, he took courses in accounting, he took courses in bookkeeping, he took courses in writing and reading and spelling and vocabulary, things that were necessary in the field of business at that time. And a lot of outstanding bankers in the state of Michigan got their fundamental training at Ferris Institute. Now, I think I mentioned once before that when Dad went to Ferris, that one of his instructors was Woodbridge Ferris himself, the man who founded the school. And Woodbridge Ferris later became a governor of the state of Michigan, and then for many, many years served as a United States Senator up until about in the 1930s, when he was replaced by Arthur Vandenberg of Grand Rapids, who was the senator for many, many years. But my dad had a class from Woodbridge Ferris. In fact, he was there when he entered. And my dad often told the story that when they got all the freshmen coming together that fall, when he went down there, this is 1903 or 4 or something like that, or whenever that year was, Ferris had the the general meeting for all the kids coming in. And my dad often says he remembers the last thing that Ferris Woodbridge said to him. Now I understand my dad even had a class from him. He said, "You're here." He said, "It's either dig in or dig out." He said, "We don't want you around here if you don't want to work." So he said, "Get at it," because he said, "We don't want your money or your parents' money unless you're willing to work." And I guess that's probably pretty good advice even today for a lot of kids. Now to get back to these other things, well, that's the way people did, regardless of where they came from. If they wanted to go on to a further school, then they had to come into town. And those early, before there was transportation, like the buses coming and picking you up, they had to get in here themselves. Now there were a few instances I recall. Now this would be before 1930. I graduated 30, and there were kids in my class from Belknap and Bismarck and Mulkey and Metz. And they got in here on their own. Sometimes they got a hold of a car, an old car. Well, I remember a bunch of fellows from Belknap area got a hold of an old model Ford. And they fixed the thing up, and they had about 5 or 6 people that rode that thing into town every day. They would go around, collect those kids, bring them into town, and take them back again in the evening. Isn't that something? That's the way they did it. They brought in their lunches. Now, before that, a lot of these kids just stayed in their own apartments. They had apartments here in town, or they stayed with relatives for their to cut down on the expense of their room and board. They brought in enough food, enough bread, enough butter, enough ham, enough cheese, bacon, and the kids knew how to cook. They knew how to boil potatoes and rutabagas, and so they ate very well. So I just thought I'd mention that as we went along here. The colleges and universities used to give these kids a chance because they knew that in many cases in the smaller communities they just did not have access to a high school. And this happened even at the best schools. I know people that were the same era my dad went to the University of Michigan. They stayed on there, they cut the mustard. Some of them became doctors, MDs, they became dentists, they became lawyers. Some of them came right back here to Roger City to practice years later. One of them, I recall, went into dentistry and then later on stayed on at the University of Michigan as an instructor in dentistry. So these kids did all right. It all depends upon what you want to do and how hard you want to work. And I guess that's true even today. You can do a lot of things if you have to do them and if there's a lot of motivation for you to do it.